You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Fort Stanwix held a key position in what is now modern Rome, New York, connecting the Mohawk River to the east and Wood Creek, leading to Lake Ontario through the Oneida Carrying Place. The British built it in 1758 amidst the French and Indian War, selecting this spot as it was the only dry area around. However, by the time the American Revolutionary War expanded into the frontier regions between New York and Quebec in 1776, the fort was pretty run down. Yet, its strategic value soared once again. The British had a strategy to take control of the Hudson River Valley. This plan, crafted by British Colonial Secretary Lord Germain and General John Burgoyne, included what King George referred to as a diversion on the Mohawk River. In March 1777, Lord Germain gave the task of leading this diversion to Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger, who was no stranger to frontier warfare, having fought in the French and Indian War. Back in April 1777, Major General Philip Schuyler from the Continental Army had a mission for the 3rd New York Regiment, led by Colonel Peter Gansevoort. Their task was to take over and refurbish Fort Stanwix, creating a stronghold against British and native attacks coming from Quebec. By May, Gansevoort and his troops got to work strengthening the fort's defences. Although they officially changed the fort's name to Fort Schuyler, most people continued calling it by its original name. The Oneida warned them that a British force was preparing for an attack by mid-July, prompting them to accelerate their work on the defences. In early July, Gansevoort reported to Schuyler, stating they were running low on food and ammunition. Schuyler responded by ordering more supplies to be sent over on July 8th. By the end of July, Gansevoort's crew received some reinforcements from 150 soldiers of the 9th Massachusetts Regiment. On the British side, St. Leger, who had just been made a brigadier general, assembled a varied force for his expedition. This included about 240 British regulars from different regiments, 250 loyalists from the King's Royal Regiment of New York, 90 Hessian Jaegers, and 50 Canadian labourers, along with a significant artillery arrangement. St. Leger thought he was going to take down a weak fort with around 60 defenders, based on the latest intelligence. However, he realized the Americans had significantly fortified Fort Stanwix after capturing some of its garrison's men. St. Leger then changed his route to Oswego on Lake Ontario, based on advice from Daniel Claus, a British Indian Department official. Upon arriving at Oswego on July 25th, they were joined by roughly 100 Rangers from Fort Niagara and a sizable group of Mohawk led by Joseph Brant. In total, St. Leger's forces were augmented by around 800 native warriors from various tribes. As they moved towards Fort Stanwix, they encountered an obstacle at Wood Creek, where the fort's defenders had knocked down trees to block their path. This forced St. Leger's troops to clear the creek and repair an old military road to get to the fort. Meanwhile, St. Leger learned of a supply convoy heading to the fort via the Mohawk River. He quickly sent Lieutenant Henry Byrd with 30 men from the 8th Regiment to intercept these supplies. Despite their efforts, Byrd and Brant, who had joined with his volunteers and the Mohawk, arrived too late. The supply convoy, protected by 100 men from the 9th Massachusetts Regiment, had already safely reached the fort, though Byrd and Brant managed to capture the convoy's bateau captain. On the evening of August 2nd, St. Leger arrived at Fort Stanwix with his troop, which included members from the 8th and 34th Regiments, the Jaegers, elite German soldiers, and a company known as the Royal Yorkers. The plan also involved the Canadians, many Rangers from the Indian Department, and additional Royal Yorkers. They were assigned the job of clearing out Wood Creek and the Oneida Carry. These paths had been deliberately blocked by the Americans with fallen trees, a tactic to slow down their enemies. This very strategy had previously been used to hinder Burgoyne's forces after they had taken Fort Ticonderoga. Earlier, Gansevoort had commanded his men to cut down trees across the Oneida Carry, creating barriers known as abattises, and now St. Leger had to deal with these obstacles before he could move his artillery forward. This task caused a delay of several days in getting the artillery to where it was needed. On the afternoon of August 3rd, St. Leger made a show of force, parading his troops, including Mohawk warriors in their war paint, in front of the fort. He sent Captain Gilbert Tice of the Indian Department carrying a flag of truce to deliver a proclamation from Major General Burgoyne. However, Gansevoort chose not to respond to the message. Despite this, Tice managed to gather useful information about the fort's defences during his visit. The next day, the construction of defensive structures, called breastworks, started. Jaeger and indigenous snipers put the fort under pressure, resulting in one casualty and several wounded defenders. On August 5th, a significant group of Seneca and Cayuga warriors joined St. Leger. That very day, Joseph Brant got news from his sister Molly, who was living at Canchohari, that an American relief force was on its way up the Mohawk Valley. Acting on this intelligence, St. Leger quickly sent out Lieutenant Colonel Sir John Johnson with a group of Royal Yorkers, Brant with his volunteers, Butler with a detachment of Rangers, some Jaegers, and a large force of indigenous warriors. Their mission was to intercept and stop the American relief column. On July 30th, the Tryon County Committee of Safety received word of St. Leger's troop movements and quickly started gathering more fighters. By August 4th, around 800 men from the local militia had come together at Fort Dayton, near what is now Herkimer, New York, under the leadership of Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer, who also chaired the committee. Just a day later, Herkimer and his troops were within 10 miles of Fort Stanwix and were joined by about 60 Oneida warriors, led by Hanyeri Tewahangarakan. When planning their surprise attack, Johnson and Butler decided to follow the lead of Brant, Cornplanter, and Sayenquerachta. On August 6th, during a violent clash near Oriskany Creek, Herkimer's militia took heavy losses. Herkimer himself was seriously injured in the leg, and about half of his men were either killed or taken prisoner. St. Leger's indigenous allies also faced significant losses. Later that afternoon, St. Leger and his men pulled back towards Fort Stanwix, and the battered militia, with Herkimer, who would later die from his injuries, chose to withdraw as well. This battle, however, cost St. Leger more than he might have anticipated. While a large part of his forces was away, Gansevoort's troops saw an opportunity and attacked. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Marinus Willett, Gansevoort's deputy, 250 men looted the enemy's nearly deserted camps, taking valuable items including personal papers and a British flag. It's worth noting, though, that the tale of hauling away wagon loads of loot might be exaggerated, as this detail mainly comes from Willett's own memoir, written much later, and earlier accounts, including Willett's, didn't mention using wagons for the job. Upon returning, the indigenous warriors and Royal Yorkers found their camps had been ransacked, with many personal items missing. Coupled with the significant losses they suffered at Oriskany, this deeply upset the Seneca and Cayuga warriors. They had been led to believe that the regular troops and loyalists would bear the brunt of the fighting, so this breach of trust soured the relationship between St. Leger and his indigenous allies, playing a critical role in the eventual failure of the siege. When the British artillery arrived, the siege really began. The essential parts of the British forces, including their 6-pounders and small mortars called cohorns, were set up on a rise to the north of the fort they were targeting. Meanwhile, most of their Native American allies and the Royal Yorkers, equipped with lighter 3-pounder cannons, took positions to the south of the fort. After a victory at Oriskany, St. Leger, the British commander, saw an opportunity to press for the fort's surrender again. He ordered a short attack with the cohorns and then sent 3 officers, including one named Butler, to deliver his terms for surrender. St. Leger's message included a threat. If the fort did not surrender, the Native American forces would attack the garrison and the communities in the Mohawk Valley from which the garrison members came. Gansevoort, leading the fort's defense, boldly rejected the demand. He told the British officers that sending such a message was beneath the dignity of British officers, emphasizing the shame in both sending and delivering such a threat. During a brief pause in the fighting, Gansevoort seized the moment to send Willett and another officer out through the swampy lands nearby to inform General Schuyler about their dire situation. Slipping through the enemy's lines, they eventually reached a group coming to help, led by Major General Benedict Arnold. By August 9th, the attackers resumed their harassment of the fort, sniping and occasionally bombarding it. They also started digging a trench, hoping it would help them break through the fort's walls. On August 13th, convinced by Johnson, Claus, and Butler, St. Leger agreed to send a delegation under a flag of truce. Their mission was to persuade the Mohawk Valley's residents to stop supporting the rebels. Walter Butler, from the 8th Regiment and son of John Butler, was chosen to lead this 18-man team. 2 days later, however, this delegation was captured at Shoemaker Tavern in German Flats. On August 8th, Schuyler heard about the situation at Oriskany and quickly sent Ebenezer Learned with the 4th Massachusetts Regiment to help the trapped fort on the following day. By August 12th, before he could even connect with Willett, Schuyler organized a meeting to figure out how to handle the threats from St. Leger and Burgoyne, who was stationed at Fort Edward with a substantial force. The group was almost unanimous in its decision to not send help to Fort Stanwix, fearing a repeat of the retreat from Ticonderoga, led by Major General Arthur St. Clair. Despite this, Schuyler pushed for a rescue mission, which Arnold volunteered to lead. Meanwhile, Israel Putnam from Peekskill, New York, sent 2 regiments to the Mohawk River Valley on August 14th, but they turned back when they learned the siege had ended. By August 20th, Arnold, Willett, and 700 soldiers had made it to Fort Dayton. Arnold tried, but only managed to gather an additional 100 militiamen. He contemplated waiting for more support from the Oneidas and Tuscaroras or another 1,000 men from Schuyler. However, the urgency rose as details emerged about St. Leger's Trench nearing the fort's defences. Facing a shortage of troops, Arnold decided to use deception. He took advantage of Hon Yost Schuyler, a Royal Yorker captive at Fort Dayton, convincing him to return to Fort Stanwix and spread false news of an impending large-scale American attack led by the Dark Eagle. As insurance, Arnold held Hon Yost's brother hostage to ensure his cooperation. Arnold's trick initially worked. St. Leger, fooled into thinking Arnold was close by with 3,000 men, found his camp in chaos by August 21st. Many of his indigenous allies had already left, and the rest, dissatisfied with the siege and their losses, threatened to leave as well. On August 22nd, St. Leger retreated to Oswego, leaving a considerable amount of equipment behind. In the aftermath, several of St. Leger's men deserted or were captured, including Hon Yost. Arnold received reinforcements from friendly Native American tribes and moved about 10 miles closer to Fort Stanwix on August 23rd. He was informed by a messenger from Gansevoort that St. Leger had left the area. Pushing forward, Arnold and his forces arrived at the fort that same evening. The following morning, he sent 500 men to chase down St. Leger, whose retreat was already being troubled by the Native Americans who had previously supported him. An advance group made it to the shores of Oneida Lake during a heavy rain, just missing St. Leger's last boats. Arnold left some of his men to guard the fort and surrounding areas along the Mohawk River, then quickly returned to the main army with around 1,200 soldiers. Meanwhile, St. Leger, while on Oneida Lake, received a message from a Native American revealing the true strength of Arnold's forces. On August 27th from Oswego, St. Leger wrote to his superior Burgoyne, planning to meet up with him by travelling through Lake Champlain. He arrived at Fort Ticonderoga on September 29th, too late to make a difference for Burgoyne, who partly blamed the failure of his campaign on St. Leger's inability to push through the Mohawk Valley and the lack of strong Loyalist support. Burgoyne had hoped that a Loyalist uprising in upstate New York would have distracted the American forces enough to make either his or St. Leger's campaign successful. He also counted on St. Leger's troops for a potential retreat. However, by the time St. Leger arrived, Burgoyne was already surrounded and surrendered after the Battle of Bemis Heights, also known as the Second Battle of Saratoga. Burgoyne later reflected that the lack of support from General William Howe allowed George Washington to redirect resources from New York City to help at both Fort Stanwix and Saratoga. After the siege, Fort Stanwix saw little direct action, but remained a challenging and disliked assignment due to constant threats from Loyalists and hostile Native American groups. In 1779, it served as a base for an attack on Onondaga Castle. The next year, a large group of Native Americans led by Joseph Brant laid siege to the garrison for several days. In the spring of 1781, the fort was largely destroyed by flood and fire, suspected to be arson, leading the American forces to abandon it. Fort Stanwix, which was destroyed in the 19th century, has a rich history. By 1935, it was recognized as a U.S. national monument, despite the area being then used for commercial and residential purposes in downtown Rome, New York. The importance of the site was further acknowledged in 1961, when it became a National Historic Landmark and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1966. In the 1970s, the National Park Service reconstructed the fort, leading to the Fort Stanwix National Monument we see today. An interesting piece of history involves the first official United States flag being flown in battle. This occurred at Fort Schuyler on August 3, 1777. The Continental Congress had made a resolution on June 14, 1777, that stated, "Resolved that the flag of the United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars white on a blue field, representing a new constellation." However, the official display of this flag saw some delays. Although the resolution was adopted in June, it wasn't signed by the Secretary of the Congress until September 3rd, despite being reported in newspapers prior. When Massachusetts reinforcements arrived at Fort Schuyler, they brought news of the official flag's adoption. To create the flag, soldiers had to be resourceful. They cut up their shirts for the white stripes, used red flannel petticoats from officers' wives for the red stripes, and found blue material from Captain Abraham Swartwood's cloth coat for the blue field. This ingenuity was recognized by Congress, which reimbursed Captain Swartwood for his coat, as shown by a voucher. This story highlights the creativity and dedication of those at Fort Schuyler during a pivotal time in American history. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.